welcome everybody on this International Day of Education, and a warm welcome to all of you TUT students. And we've had some pretty inspiring speakers already. So this is an example of what ShareScreen does. We bring guest speakers to the classroom on topics that you request. Now, nobody requested this topic, so this was a choice by me, but this is an example of what we can do for you. So I'm going to launch straight into today's topic then, and we're going to look at food webs, productivity, and trophic collapse. All right, so biodiversity and ecosystems are all part of this field of ecology. To be a conservationist, like Dr. Nick spoke of, like all of us are in this university to learn, we are part of this field of ecology. And ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between living organisms and their environment. But remember, the environment is both living, biotic, and non-living, abiotic. So think about where you're sitting right now in your chair. Think about who you're interacting with. You're interacting with your professors, with us as speakers. Dr. Nick is there with you in your classroom. Where are the abiotic and where are the biotic factors? You're sitting at a desk. That is non-living. You have light in your classroom. That is non-living. So all of these live and interact in what is called an ecosystem. And ecosystems is what we as conservationists are setting out to protect. So in this photo on the right, you can see is a snapshot of the Masai Mara. I was there at Christmas. And it's the Greater Mara ecosystem. And this is near the Talek River, for those of you who might have visited. All right, so let's start then with two key terms that I want you as students to have on the tip of your tongue the whole way through your learning. Biodiversity. What is it? Well, it's the variety of life in a particular ecosystem, or even in the earth as a whole. And we have desert ecosystems, savanna ecosystems, coral reefs, caves, and then we have forests, but think about the forest canopy, and then the forest floor, as well as all of that space in between. And then we have an ecosystem, and that we've already spoken of is the community of living and non-living things that interact in that environment. So where can we find other ecosystems, and what biodiversity might they contain? Now, Dr. Nick said you may have elephants in your future to look forwards to. You may have all sorts of different ecosystems that you are going to interact with. But there are ecosystems right there in the quad of your university, at home in your garden. But one example would be the desert. Now, some of the things that occur there would be desert insects. They're adapted to live in that terrain. There's grazers and browsers that live there. Remember, grazers feed on the grass, browsers feed on all the bushes and other vegetation. You've got foragers, maybe rodents that are digging and finding seeds and tubers. You've got birds that are adapted to live in those high temperatures, high in the day, low at night. And you've got specially adapted plants for the desert. But what about the ocean? You've got benthic organisms. Benthic is just a fancy word for ground dwelling. You've got surface dwellers. So the types of organisms that are living in that very top layer of water that's warm and gets a lot of light. But then you've got all the creatures of the water column between the benthic and the top. You've got plants and algae, and you've got many different forms of microorganisms. The savanna, this is something, a biodiversity within an ecosystem that you will have heard of. Plains game. Plains game is the sort of word we give all the animals that live on the plains, the zebras, the ostriches, the giraffes. These are plains game. But of course, who feeds on those are the predators. But maybe you have burrowers, porcupines, aardvarks. You have birds that occur in the savanna that may not occur in the desert. And again, you have plenty of insects. And of course, these are not exhaustive lists. There are plenty more examples of biodiversity in each of these ecosystems. So I'm going to start with 4 key terms. And again, these are terms that I want you to have at the tip of your tongue. Habitat. What is habitat? Well, this is the place where an organism or a group of organisms live. So here in this example of the desert, we've got hot days, cold nights, very little rain. This is a desert habitat. And living in that is a population. Here we've got a desert oryx. And this is a population is the individuals of the same species that live in a particular area. And then we've got ecological niches. So this desert lizard is filling an ecological niche. But what is an ecological niche? Well, this is the space that this organism fills within its habitat. It is the ecological role that that organism plays within its habitat. You, as conservationists, your niche is to work at preserving the planet, the biodiversity for the future. That is your niche, and it's sometimes hard. So there are 2 questions to ask of this lizard as our example. How does this lizard interact with its ecosystem? And what affects its ability to live in that ecosystem? Now, remember that we said ecology was the scientific, and I want you to remember that, the scientific study. I don't want you to bring in all of these other things that we hear in the media that don't really add up to scientific knowledge. So ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between living organisms, this lizard, and their environment. Remembering that the environment is both biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living. So this lizard is dealing with food availability. It's dealing with predators. Can it survive with those 2? Some of the abiotic factors, the non-living factors that it needs to contend with. Temperature. If it's too hot, that lizard won't survive. If it gets too cold, it may not survive. The landscape characteristic. Does it have somewhere to hide from its predators? Does it have somewhere to hide from the sun? Soil nutrients, light and moisture. All of these affect the ability of that lizard to inhabit that ecological niche. Think about what affects your ability to inhabit the ecological niche that you want to carve out for yourself with the journey that you're about to go on at this university. So the niche then is the role or the position of that species within an ecosystem. It includes its relationships with other species and with the physical and climatic requirements. So the Namib desert lizard inhabits a specific niche. It eats certain food, it likes to live in sand burrows, and it can live between certain temperatures. So it will compete for these with other lizard species, with beetles, and maybe even with small mammals. So each is adaptive to live in its own specific niche. A community then. Well, this is a group of different species that interact with each other in a particular ecosystem. So here we've got lizards, oryx, giraffe, ostrich, martial eagles. These all form the community within that desert biome, that desert habitat. And communities and populations inhabit different niches within that habitat. But how do these oryx survive? Well, this brings in adaptation. And these are the characteristics of the species that help it to survive and reproduce in its environment. So what are the characteristics that you need to develop to stay positive in your conservation career? Well, for these oryx, they can raise their body temperature to prevent perspiration. That means the loss of body water during the day. They can concentrate their urine so they're not losing water where they don't need to. They can remove moisture from their feces. They can run fast to avoid predators. They can trap body heat in that thick undercoat, and that keeps them warm at night. And they can eat roots, tubers, bulbs, and even melons, and that gives them their moisture. But who else does this? Pretty much every animal in the desert. So this brings in competition. And that is the interaction between organisms or species in which they compete for those living and non-living, the biotic and abiotic resources, such as food, water, and space. And remember that word, a community. A community is a group of different species that are interacting with each other in that particular ecosystem. So what is their competition for? Here's a brown hyena. He's also looking for tubers. He's looking for food. He's looking for shelter or shade, a place to make a den, water. So this brings me then onto trophic levels. And this is something to really understand and be aware of as you walk around and as you learn through the coming year. So trophic levels are different levels in an ecosystem that are defined by the feeding relationships. So at the bottom of the triangle there, we have producers. These are green plants. So here I have an image of grass. Who's feeding on that grass? We have a hare. So he would be a primary consumer. Feeding on that hare, perhaps a genet. So that genet would be a secondary consumer. Feeding on the genet, perhaps an owl. That would be a tertiary consumer. So this forms what we call food chains. So food chains then are a linear sequence of organisms in an ecosystem. And it is through this chain that energy and nutrients flow. Starts with a producer, like we said. Then we have a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer, and then we have detritophores. These are the things like worms that will break down the dead bodies of these organisms back into the soil and feed those nutrients back into the grass. Dung beetles, they also roll the dung of a lot of these organisms, and then they bury that dung ball into the grass, into the soil, and the nutrients can go round again. So let's look at this a little more closely. Trophic comes from the Latin food, so it is a food level. So producers, these are called autotrophs. Autotrophs, auto, make your own, troph, food. So these are organisms that can produce their own food, and they can do that in two ways. One is photosynthesis. Remember, to do photosynthesis, you need chlorophyll, so something green. But you may also be able to make your own foods using chemosynthesis, which is using chemicals. And these are the foundations of food chains. And they convert that precious energy from the sun into inorganic compounds and into organic matter, which is then fed on. So here we have a caterpillar who's eating that leaf. So that caterpillar, he or maybe she, is a primary consumer. That caterpillar is called a heterotroph. So it cannot produce its own food. Hetero, other, troph, food, other, feeding. So they have to consume other organisms to get their energy. Then we have a secondary consumer. That robin chat is eating the caterpillar, which was eating the producer, the plant. We may have a tertiary consumer. This bird of prey is eating a baby bird, which was perhaps its mother eating the caterpillar that was eating the plant. And then, of course, we have decomposers or detritivores. And these are organisms that break down dead matter into nutrients. But don't forget that they can also form part of the food chain itself. So there are animals that do feed on, of course, worms and fungi. We eat mushrooms, but these mushrooms are critically important to breaking down organic matter and feeding the nutrients back into this trophic chain. So if we look at a couple of food chains again, and I want you to be thinking along with me. Grass, eaten by springbok. Springbok, eaten by cheetah. Dung beetles, rolling the dung of both of these animals. And the worms are breaking down any matter, maybe matter that the cheetah has not finished eating of the springbok, or maybe the cheetah's died and it's breaking it down. Here, it's not the clearest picture, but is a fly on a piece of fungi. Chameleon eats that fly. Snake eats that chameleon. And a bird of prey attempts to eat that snake. And again, the worms are in there, working their magic. Healthy soil means healthy fauna. Soil comes first. So we've spoken then about the trophic levels, but what about the energy transfer? And this is important because energy flow is the movement of energy through the different trophic levels. From the producers, remember they're getting their energy from the sun, into the primary, secondary, and finally the tertiary consumers. Any animal species that lives in that small box at the top, the tertiary consumer, that is the apex of the pyramid. So they are considered to be an apex predator. So if we look here, if the sun was giving 1,000,000 joules of sunlight, primary producers would only be able to trap about 10,000 joules of that. The primary consumers who feed on those plants are taking only 1,000 joules forward. Into the secondary consumers, 100 joules. Into the tertiary consumers, those are the apex of the pyramid, to 10 joules. So it really is a huge decline in energy. So you can see here with where that energy is being lost. It's being lost through heat. It's being lost through movement. So when a snake eats that rabbit, it needs to eat a lot more than the rabbit does of grass to get the same amount of energy. That means we can call this trophic pyramid a food chain, an energy pyramid, or even a biomass pyramid. Biomass is the amount of wet or dry matter. So there's a lot more grass than there are birds of prey. But come on, let's be realistic. The food chain is a bit too simple because there are just huge complex relationships between all these species, between us in this chain. So a food web is a complex network of interconnected food chains in an ecosystem, and they show the multiple feeding relationships between organisms. Here in this food web, you can clearly see that vultures are feeding on dead animals, that lions are feeding on both wildebeest and gazelle and zebra, then the hyenas in there, then the bacteria and the fungi are in there, and we form this level of web where everything is working off each other. So let's look at a couple more of these. Here we've got a rainforest food web drawn by Sherry Ansell. And you can see here that it's a little bit different. We've got an okapi in the bottom left there, who's a primary consumer. The okapi is directly browsing off the greenery in the forest. But maybe there's a species that is eating that okapi. You know, and who is eating that species? So in every place where you are, I want you to be thinking, what is the food web in the place I am standing right now? What is the food web in your city centre with your pigeons and your miners and your cats and your dogs and humans? Don't forget. We have coral reefs. They have their own food web, something that is fascinating for those of you who want to go into coral ecology. So all of these show trophic productivity. And remember, we've seen this flow of energy through the pyramid, from the base to the top, all brought by light energy from the sun, the loss of heat. There's waste and dead matter that is coming from all of those segments to the decomposers. So what is trophic productivity then? Well, that's the rate at which energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. And that's specific to the ecosystem you're looking at. And you usually measure this in units of energy, which makes sense. Now, for producers, as an example, it's the rate at which they convert the energy from the sun into organic matter. Whereas for, say, primary consumers, it's the rate at which they convert organic matter of plants into their own biomass. And that is your trophic productivity. And we spoke of the different ecosystems, a desert ecosystem, an ocean ecosystem. They will have different trophic productivities, and these can be measured. So, oops, sorry. That hopefully is an idea of a food web for you. And I have drawn one here myself, and they're very fun to draw. So this is something I encourage you to do and engage with and think about the areas where you're living and what's going on. Because I'm going to bring to you 3 new definitions. We're going to look at trophic shifts, at trophic cascades, and at trophic collapses. Now remember, the word trophic just means feed. So feeding shifts, feeding cascades, and feeding collapses. So let's first look at a famous trophic shift. Now I know that that image is not the clearest. This image represents the cichlid species in Lake Victoria, the biggest lake in Africa. Cichlids are a species of fish that are traded very highly for the aquarium trade, but they're very specific species that exist. And there were over 400 species of cichlids in Lake Victoria. And there was this incredible food web in the water there. And then along came humans, and we introduced Nile perch. Nile perch is an enormous fish, absolutely enormous. So what happened is the Nile perch ate all of the cichlids and pretty much established itself in the place of many different individuals. So now there are only 4 main predators in that food web, from 400 to 4. You've got the big Nile perch, the smaller perches, the Nile tilapia, and one other species there. So what happened when the perch came in? Well, there was this extinction of 200 species of cichlids. There are still many cichlids that exist there, but they don't really stand a chance in this food web with the Nile perch, although they are able to survive. There's been a huge increase in the algal levels because so many cichlids died off. The algae was able to bloom. Remember, the algae is on the very base of the pyramid. there's been a decrease of oxygen in the lake and an increased number of insects because there weren't the cichlids to eat them. So what is a trophic shift then? Remember, trophic, feeding. A feeding shift is a change then in the dominant species at a particular trophic level in that ecosystem. So we've gone from cichlids being in that position to Nile perch usurping that position. That is a trophic shift. All right, let's move to a trophic cascade then. Now, this is a series of changes in an ecosystem that occur because there's a change in a trophic level. So let's say we have sharks feeding on these mesopredators, which feed on herbivores, which feed on algae. Let's remove the sharks from that cascade, from that food chain. And we will say that there will be a cascading effect. The mesopredators don't have anyone feeding on them anymore, so they will increase in number. Suddenly there are so many of them that the herbivores all get eaten. So there's no herbivores. And then the algae goes, well, hold on, there's no one feeding on me, and the algae increases tenfold, which then sucks all of the oxygen out, and there's often a die-off. So that trophic cascade happens when there's a change in that trophic level. Here's an example that might resonate with you. The Urban Raptor project, which I'm sure Kaylin knows lots about in South Africa. Basically, we've had many, many species of raptors across Africa being knocked out using rodenticide, using shooting, all sorts of reasons. So they are no longer feeding on the rats and the vermin. I shouldn't really say vermin because nothing is vermin unless we label it like that. The rodents in our urban areas. So the Urban Raptor project has trained Jack Russells. And the Jack Russells go out there and they kill all of these rodents. Of course, if we did still have as many eagles and birds of prey as we should, those Jack Russells would be food in the food chain as well. And it does happen in some of the crowned eagles seen around the Durban area. So this is a trophic cascade. There's an effect that cascades through that food chain, through that food web. All right, what about trophic collapse? Now, this refers to the complete or the near complete disappearance of a population or an entire trophic level within an ecosystem. And it can be the result of all sorts of reasons: overfishing, pollution, invasive species. And this has happened in ecosystems across the world. Where we are destroying wetlands, we are creating trophic collapse. The disappearance of pollinators is something that you may have heard of. The whole pyramid will come crashing down when there are no pollinators. Fisheries being overfished. And this is so famous across the world, from the collapse of the cod fisheries in Newfoundland and Canada in the 90s, the sardine fisheries in California in the 40s, and kelp forests along the coast of California. And I'm sure there have been many examples on our southern African coasts as well. Large mammal removal. Now, I want every one of you, when you've finished and you get home this evening, I want you to look up the wolves of Yellowstone, because this is one of the stories that is depicted. What happens when we remove the large mammals in our trophic pyramids? Complete logging of old growth forests. There's nothing, no habitat left for anybody to live anymore. And it affects us as well. Kelp forest destruction. You know, these are things that have cascading effects on everything and can lead to collapse. So this is trophic collapse. And I'm 3 slides off finishing, but I want to bring in ecosystem collapse, because this is why we are in this field. or this is why I feel we should also be in this field, is because we need to stop ecosystem collapse. Now, ecosystem collapse refers to the situation in which an ecosystem experiences such a drastic reduction in biodiversity and productivity that it simply cannot go on. And of course, this can happen because of human factors. So I've depicted war here, clear felling logging, and that's an oil spill. But it can also happen by nature itself. So perhaps a volcanic eruption, perhaps fire, or perhaps simply drought. So all of these can lead to ecosystem collapse. And this is what Dr. Nick said, conservation is forever. You do not get to be a conservationist on Monday to Friday. When you sign up to this career, you are a conservationist 24/7, Christmas Day, your birthday, and every other day in the year. So finally, what about adding toxins to a food web? You can see this food web from raptors are the solution, and I too am very, very keen on raptors in our environment. If you add some sort of poison bait down there at the bottom to the fish, or you poison the rodents, and you do not ensure correct incineration of those toxic biomass, which is now a dead organism, you are now allowing that to go all the way through your food web. And there are just two more terms I want to bring to you. Bioaccumulation. So this is where the pollutant or the toxic substance enters the food chain. And then over time, each individual stores it in its fatty tissues and it builds up, it accumulates. Bio, natural, accumulation. So over time, as that small fish grows into being a big fish, it now holds more contaminant in its cells. Biomagnification, on the other hand, is through the feeding, the trophic levels. So the crustaceans are fed on by fish who then absorb the contaminants that were in the crustaceans. Those contaminants are small enough for those crustaceans to live with, but these fish now have a higher level. They're fed on by seals who then build up even more. And then we have polar bears feeding on those seals, and that toxin is now biomagnified. So let's just recap what we've gone over then. Because biodiversity is the variety of life in a particular ecosystem or on Earth as a whole. And that is what has attracted us to being conservationists. It's incredible. There is nothing more incredible than real life itself. Don't ever forget that. And those ecosystems, those living and those non-living things are going to be the basis of our studies, of our journey, of what we're looking at. We're going to learn about habitats, niches, communities, populations. I want you to be thinking where you fit. Where's your habitat? Have you found your niche yet? Your professional niche, your personal niche? Who's your community? The biotic and the abiotic factors, competition and adaptation with those. How do you interact? How do these things work for you? How can you get them to work for you so that you can protect biodiversity and ecosystems? Food chains, trophic levels, food webs, productivity. All these terms might be overwhelming, but you can fit yourself into them. You can make this fit to your story. Energy pyramids, biomass pyramids. These are things that will make sense to you as you move forward. Bioaccumulation, biomagnification. You know, these are things that are important. They might be depressing. And if there's one thing we can say about being a conservationist, is that boy, do you face a grim tomorrow, but you have to keep fighting for a brighter future. We want trophic shifts, trophic cascades, trophic collapse to be understood. across the world, for us to make our impact in the area that we call home.